So don't let me take any more of your time. Dave Harris.
Hold your applause till the end. No, I'm just kidding. You don't have to hold your applause. I thought you said your husband was around. Oh, okay. He disappeared. Well, that screen's a lot closer than usual, so now I can see it. This will be good. All right. So, the flood, right? We've been talking about this all week. I don't think I have as much overlap as everybody else. Ooh, that was really loud when I got right into it. You may not even need me to have this on tonight. I'm so close to you. I don't, there's, the people online though. Oh, can they see me? Is the camera able to dip down that far? Okay. Oh, back it up a little bit though. I don't overlap as much as other folks. I'm not talking about animals or the building the ark and everything else that went on the nights before. We're simply talking about the water tonight. We are simply talking about understanding it so that we can better get a grasp of how we feel about it, whether we feel like it's feasible, I guess is the right word. I don't know that we could ever wrap our minds around anything God does and say, well, that's feasible in today's terms, but in God's terms, anything's feasible, anything's possible. We just have to think about how it could have happened in that time. So, okay, good. All right. Let's get started with that. When we talk about what the world believes about the earth, it's this idea of uniformitarianism. And sometimes I think they just do things like that to add letters to words. But when I looked it up, I was really trying to dumb it down for myself, because if I don't understand it, I don't know how I'll be able to explain it. So when I think about what uniformitarianism is, it's this idea that it's a gradual change, it's uniform processes, it's a long period of time. So, and that's what this one definition got for me that made the most sense to me. So when we think about what uniformitarianism is, it means that some people believe that the earth has evolved or become the way it is because of a long, those millions of years worth of things that have happened to it. All of those impacts that have occurred over time. He says here in this that he says the assumption that undergirds, see, these would not be my words, right? That undergirds virtually every argument for an old earth is the idea in geology that processes that we can witness today are responsible for all geologic features, meaning all things continue today as they have from the beginning. According to this assumption, no miraculous worldwide catastrophic activity has ever occurred that might explain physical phenomena and scientific observations. So I think about like the Grand Canyon, right? If you've ever been able to witness and look at the Grand Canyon, it's amazing. It's enormous. It's immense. It's hard to fathom how that came into existence. And their explanation, right? The world and the scientists in the world would explain that by saying, well, the Colorado River has been eroding the Grand Canyon for millions of years, and therefore it's kind of made it wider and wider and deeper, and that's why it is what it is today, right? So we're trying to talk through that and that uniformitarianism kind of perspective and make sure we understand exactly how the flood disproves that and helps us understand it. In 2 Peter 3, he gives us this verse here. It's on the screen if you don't want to look it up, but it's an ESV, so your version might be slightly different. He says, "For they deliberately overlook this fact that the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and through water by the word of God, and that by means of these, the world that then existed was deluged with water and perished. From 2 Peter 3, 5, and 6. So Peter sits and talks about these scoffers, these people who would come and would have this mindset that, well, there wouldn't have been a flood. How could God have done that? You know, we trust in what we see, not in what we believe, kind of perspective. And just like was mentioned when Jared taught on Tuesday, the implications of the flood spread into every scientific discipline. While scientific evidences that verify the biblical testimony of the flood are exciting to study, the spiritual implications of the flood is what we really have to focus on and be aware of. So let's look at some of the verses that kind of give us some of that understanding. Because as I was thinking about it, I was in the car with, I'm supposed to tell you, like I have permission to say, Vicki doesn't have to have surgery. She just has to have 6 weeks of physical therapy. So she was very excited today after we got back from the doctor. And she still likes my driving. So sometimes Wendy has to drive. It just depends on what's going on. But anyway, I had to share that with you. But we were having a conversation in the car today because we were talking about the flood. We were talking about how, I've seen it rain for days, right? Everybody's seen it rain, and you're like, I haven't seen the sun in forever. And we really can't grasp how if it rains really bad, the rivers are going to rise, and we know some flooding, right? I remember helping down in Newport and on the river with some of the flooding and some of the people that were dealing with it back in 97, I think it was, wasn't it? Yeah. Those people that really dealt with a lot of that flooding. Well, that was from the river rising, from all the rain collecting. But can you picture, we're way up from the river, right? Can you picture the water, being above the roof of our building? Or can you picture not being able to see land when you're standing on your front porch? And I just can't fathom that. Because that's a lot of water. That's just an unbelievable amount of water. And this wasn't, and we'll also get into in just a few minutes the fact that this was a global event, not a localized event. But we'll get to that in a minute. In point number 4. So, Genesis chapter 7. So if you want to turn there, that's where we'll look. But I'm sure, a lot of these verses we've kind of talked a lot this week. Genesis chapter 7. I'm going to turn there as well. And verse 11. It says in my version, it says, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. So there's a couple references we're going to make here. And we'll actually also come back to this as we look at our timeline and think about how long they were in the boat. Ark, ship, whatever. The fountains, when we think about fountains, the fountains opening up, when the flood began, the fountains opened up from the great deep. The terminology, he said, suggests that the breakup of the ocean floor, releasing water and magma from below the Earth's surface onto the ocean floor. Using our knowledge of geology in the 21st century, such terminology suggests plate tectonics. I'm getting above my education level here, which is the breakup and an initiation of the movement of the plates that comprise the surface of the Earth, may have been activated at this point. So we think about the water coming up, right? We've understood that up until this time. How had they seen water come to them before this time? We think of mist, yes. I mean, there were springs and there were bodies of water that they had access to, and where they were living was probably not necessarily the desert area it is today, just because of how things have changed. But so when we think about that, this idea that the water comes welling up from the ground as well as coming down from the heavens, it's very interesting, because then he says in verses 11 and 12, he talks about, and the windows of heaven were, I'll change slides. And the windows of heaven were opened up, and the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Intense rain. Windows of heaven, this idea of opening up the windows of heaven. I don't know, when we think about windows of heaven, does anybody have a different word than windows here? Windows of heaven. No? Genesis 7:11. Windows. Floodgates. Lattice, window, chimney. Okay. It's just interesting always to look at the origin of the word. So this idea that, he used the word deluge of water coming from down and from up at the same time. It's just this overwhelmingly impact of water, right? Coming from everywhere around them. In fact, if we go down a few verses in chapter 7, verse 17, it talks here in 17, 18, now the flood was on the earth 40 days, and the waters increased and lifted up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and greatly increased on the earth, and the ark moved about on the surface of the waters. And then down in 24, and the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. And like I mentioned, we're going to talk a timeline here when we get to a good spot, and we can have that opportunity. But when we think about how the waters increase, the boat is actually floating above the ground, and we've talked about how big that was, right? I wasn't able to be here. Did you talk about how much it might have weighed? I mean, I think about that boat over in what, Williamstown? What do you call that area? Yeah. The ark that's over there that we can all go see, and how big that would have to be, and how much water would have to lift that up. That just also helps me. I'm such a visual person. I'm such a visual learner. That increase of that water. The other thing is about this whole thing is that in the scope of it all is that this was a global flood. And I thought it was interesting, some of the things he thought about here. He said, why build an ark? If the flood was local, why waste several decades building an ark? Why not just leave the area? And then why bring animals onto the ark from all over if the flood was local? Representatives of every living thing of all flesh. Since God actually sent the animals to Noah anyway, why not just send them out of the area instead versus putting them on the boat? You know? They have a lot of intelligence. Even cattle. You know, we grew up and people told us not to stand under trees when it's lightning, but that's what the cows do, right? They all go huddle under a tree and lay down, and so I guess so they don't get blown away if they're standing up. But yeah, I mean, the animals are smart enough. They could have gotten out of the way if it was local. The other thing that he mentioned here was, how could the water cover the mountains? In Genesis 7:19, we almost had gotten there in those verses we were reading when it said, and the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. So we understand that there was so much water here that even some of these high hills were covered. We'll get back to the mountain idea here in a minute. And then, is God a liar? I mean, if there wasn't a flood, if there wasn't a global flood, that would imply that we don't believe what God is saying, and what in His Word and His covenant that He makes with Noah. So we go through this. We go through all of this and understand how much water actually came upon the earth, how much it actually went. And then we get to this period of time where the water starts subsiding. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heaven are stopped, and the rains from heaven are restrained, it says in those first few verses of Genesis chapter 8. And at the end of 150 days, the waters decreased. When I think about, Brett, if you don't mind, I think this is a good time, because he says, after coming up to rest in the mountain of Ararat, the water continued to recede for roughly 7 months until the earth was dry. Could you put, yeah, perfect. So, this is not mine, so we need to validate, right? Always test and then verify, or what was it? Trust and then verify. Sorry, that would be duplication if we tested and verified. This idea that we understand, see, I can put my glasses back on. I don't know if you guys can read that or not. But we understand that in the 600th year, 2nd month, 17th day, we just read that verse of Noah's life, that the flood starts, right? That's when when God seals them in, and 40 days go by and the ark is lifted up. 150 days go by, and that's when the waters stop. So they've been in there now for, so they've been in there now for 150 days. He says there's 110 days between the 150 day and the 40 day. I didn't interpret it that way. I thought it was in 150 days incrementally. Bless you. And then we get past that point, so the water starts to recede. And how long does it take to recede? It takes that full, 74 days to recede down. Well, it takes a lot longer than that to recede down, but that's the moment that they stop moving and are settled. And then he sends the birds out, and then the earth is dry. So the expectation that this person had was that the earth was dry at 370 days. Yes, sir. Well, okay. Is that Noah's birthday? Well, he was 600 years and 2 months and 17 days old. Well, it is the Hebrew calendar too. It's not necessarily the Roman calendar. Huh? Okay. Well, so when the flood started, it was 2 months and 17 days after his birthday. Or yeah. What's that? I didn't. Yeah, it says in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month and the 17th day of the month. So he's 600 years old. It's 2.5 months since he blew out the candles. That's a lot of candles, right? And so this is when it all starts, right? This is when it all begins. But then when we get down to this spot, where was the other one? Down in verse 13 of chapter 8. Does he quote that? No, he doesn't. But it says here, and it came to pass on the 601st year, in the 1st month, the 1st day of the month, that the waters were dried up from the earth, and Noah removed the cover of the ark and looked, and indeed the surface of the ground was dry. And in the 2nd month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dried. And he said, go out of the ark. So he's been in there. If I assume they have 365 days a year, he's been in there a full year. It's the 2nd month and 10 days longer. And they didn't have 365 because they didn't know about leap years yet, and their calendar was much more even. They didn't have 31 days and 30 days and 31 days. But anyway, and we could go and get into the Hebrew calendar and everything else like that. But so it was going from his 600 until he was 601, basically, is what we see here. And then we just have to think about how that all breaks up. Bill, were you? Oh, I thought you had your hand up. You're just waving your glass. All right. Wesley, that makes sense? Wesley and I were talking last night. He's like, are you going to have a timeline? So, but it helped me. It really did. Because, a lot of times all I thought about was, 40 days, and then it rained 150. But here's the other thing I think about a lot, right? And this does overlap, but I think about those animals. I know a lot of us have dogs or have daughters who want dogs. And, No. So we all have, and if you know how your dog is, we talked about when they went on the ark, they were probably little. It only takes a year for that dog to get like 3 times, 4 times, 5 times as big, right? And we think about those animals on the ark and the amount of food that would have been required to feed them for an entire year. I don't know what would have happened. Again, with God, anything's feasible, anything's possible, right? Did they go into hibernation for 12 months? I don't know. God's got way more power and way more understanding than I can even comprehend about how he makes that happen. So, all right. Any other thoughts or ponderings or musings? I believe so. Especially just looking at when he says, 600 years, 2 months and 17 days, and then he says 601, 2 months and 27 days. So to me, right there alone, I think that's the 370. I don't know how we divide them up. I think this is pretty good. Again, this is not mine. But I liked the way they had it broken out and everything. And there's scriptures at the bottom, and if anybody wants it, I can send it to you, just so you can dig into it a little bit more. Always kind of check the stuff. Any other thoughts? Okay. When we get into, there's a couple more things here. So we went through all of those numbers. Oh, Brett, you may have to take me back to number 5 that I was on. I'm all confused as to where my pages are. So number 5 was the subsiding. This is a very interesting point here when we get to number 6. This was interesting to me, but this talks about our whole Grand Canyon feel, right? This talks about mountains. Did the flood have to cover Mount Everest? I've always thought that. This is making me think a little bit. So I'm gonna encourage you guys to think too, and we'll kind of. No, according to the Bible said it covered all the hills that were there, and then when we get to Psalm 104, it says that the mountains rose and the valley sank because of the flood. You know what I mean? Because when the fountains opened, and we just talked about those tectonic plates shifting and changing, the earth changed, right? The earth, we saw some overlaps and some major things going on here. And things I think, Dave's opinion, we went from Pangea to having multiple continents in the world and the waters separating lands and everything like that. So he gets into this and he says, okay, so Psalm 104 speaks to, who had their hand up? Oh, Bill, just a second. Let me read this point and then you can make your comment. He says, Psalm 104 speaks to creation and the flood. Verses 6 through 9 refer to the flood and tell us that the mountains rose and the valleys sank during this event. While some higher elevation locations apparently existed prior to the flood, the taller mountains formed during the flood. According to Genesis 7:19-20, it says, and the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered. How much is a cubit? It's like this, right? 50. Yeah. Just depends on how tall you are, right? Bill. Say, you're going to have to say it louder because I. No, I'm not saying that the mountains weren't covered by the flood. I'm saying because of the flood, new mountains were formed. As the flood was happening. I've never pictured that before. I don't know if anybody else has. Yeah. And then he had to do it again. Yeah. I didn't know if you were saying. But I think that helps me think a lot more, right? Because at first I'm thinking, where did all this water come from? Mount Everest is a really tall mountain, right? I, I mean, that would be a lot of water. But if Mount Everest didn't appear until during the flood, until it was created because the fountains of the deep caused all kinds of chaos, and then all of a sudden the amount of water needed for the flood changes. Yes. Yes. Well, did it rest upon, it rested upon the top of Mount Ararat, but how, I don't know which one, yeah. Where does it say that? There it is. It's in verse 4 of chapter 8. The ark rested in the 7th month, the 7th day of the month, on the mountains of Ararat. Could have been between a couple of them. Yes, sir. Yes, it totally does. But I mean, if you thought that the mountains appeared because of the flood, could Noah have rested lower? It's just an interesting thought. And you see these people always trying to find Noah's ark, right? But who's to say Noah didn't build the altar that he made to God out of the ark? Who's to say they didn't build their homes out of the ark? All these different ideas that the ark may have been, they were recycling before recycling was cool, This idea that the ark's probably not out there because they probably used it. Yes, exactly. Especially if they're up in the mountains. Huh? Yeah, the trees would have been small. That's a great point. I like this. Yes, sir. Bless you. Yeah. Yeah. It's just so fascinating. I don't know, yeah. Yeah. Okay, so let's keep going. There's number 7. Yeah. You set a boundary that the forming of boundaries. So we talked about different lands and different areas. Psalm 104, again, if you read those 6 through 9, it really talks a lot about the flood and that kind of situation. So if we move into evidence of the flood scientifically, they've got a few things in here, and I'm going to kind of breeze through them unless somebody's got a strong desire for science knowledge. So they talk a lot about the sedimentary rock layers, right, that you see. And again, I go back to the Grand Canyon, which is what this picture is. And they talk about those layers, and everybody talks, oh, well, you can see a century for every layer of rock. And I'm like, well, who brought the rock in to lay on top of the last one? But so they have all of this information that talks about how they've identified 6 mega sequences of sediment rock layers at the Grand Canyon that can now be followed across North America. The chalk bed of the Cretaceous period, like the White Cliffs of Dover, extend from Ireland through England, across the English Channel into Europe, and on down through Middle East, Egypt, and even Kazakhstan. Even more notable is the fact that the same chalk beds found sandwiched between the same strata are found in the Midwestern U.S., Western Australia, even into the Caspian Sea of Russia. So there's a lot of these similarities that you see everywhere, of these layers of rock that wouldn't have occurred if it hadn't been a global flood. I thought this was very interesting to me because when I was 10, 11, 12 years old, and times were different and kids could disappear for hours and you didn't assume that they were missing. My friends and I would ride back to where the subdivision ended and the adventure began, and we would go down this old dry creek bed and we found these rocks with fossils in them. And they were brachium, I don't know, all these different little, and we were like, this is so cool. It's Jurassic Park. Because that movie was popular when I was younger. We went out and found all these rocks, and we thought it was so cool. But this idea that they're finding fossils up in the mountains, that when they gone up into the Himalayan mountains and found things like that as well, it's very even the tallest mountain range in the world, the mighty Himalayas, host marine fossils. Isn't that interesting? And then finally, he talks about the Cambrian explosion. According to Genesis 1 and following, a few thousand years ago, God directly created all kinds of life within 4 days, not by evolution, over 4 billion years. Approximately 1,650 years after that initial creation, the flood occurred. If the flood was, in fact, global in extent, it destroyed all birds, all land-living creatures, and there were not on the vessel prepared for the survivors of that catastrophic event. Based on that information, creation geologists and paleontologists can make several scientific predictions. So they talk about how you can understand how old the earth is because of the flood. You don't have to try to work the flood into the 65 million year theory. And then because of that, here are their predictions that they go through, and I'm just going to throw them all out there at the same time. There aren't any transitional fossils, just like there's no missing links today. There's no living creatures that would be fully formed and functional when they first appeared. So there's a lot of things out there that kind of just talk about the fact that the Cambrian explosion not only falsifies evolutionary predictions, but it verifies all of these flood predictions that are out there as well. So, any questions or thoughts? Actually, don't ask me any questions on that part, but if you have any thoughts, you're welcome to share them. Isn't this interesting when you're trying to teach something really sciencey and you're not a sciencey person, right? It's very, it's like I'm going back to school again, and this is my 10th grade biology class or something. So this, this was still back on that page. So let's the biblical interpretation of the scientific evidence for the flood. So he talks about how in Genesis 17:11 they taught this idea that the platelets were shifting, that everything was going on, and he gives us this great visual, not just here of the inner core and the outer core and everything going on, but this one right here to me was very, very helpful because it talks about that whole how the plate would shift to let the water out, and it would raise up certain parts of the land masses that were going on. So you've got the rain coming down and the sea level rising and everything that was going on at that time. Does anybody want more? If you want more details on this, I just want to get to the biblical part of it. Not that this isn't important. Because they've even got some of these things where it talks about how this is a NASA image of the plates, the tectonic plates. They've always moved at the same slow rate that they're moving today. They haven't moved any faster or slower because that would imply if they had been moving for that many millions of years, then they would have. A lot of different things would have happened. So. All right. And there's a short, I don't know how, do you have the video, Brett? I don't know if you've got the video in there. It's called What Happened During the Flood. We're supposed to be done at 7. Are we supposed to be done at 7:30? So 8 is okay? Jerry's the only honest one with me. Everybody else is, you're funny, Dave. Okay. Well, no, and I don't want to go that long. It was more like 5 or 10 minutes. You have it on there? How long is it? Oh, no, that's too long. Okay. Brett's got a great video. If anybody wants to see it, make sure you let him know. And hopefully you've got enough, you're feeling like you have enough facts and enough information, and if you, and honestly, I joke a lot, but I'm happy to share and sit down and talk about it with you if you want to. This is all to reinforce and make sure our faith is strong, right? This is all to help us feel good when somebody says, well, the flood couldn't have happened. How could Mount Everest have been covered by water? Stuff that I've always kind of had questions in my mind, but I've been okay. That's all right. I got faith. I can worry about that when I get up and ask my list of questions in heaven. So, I'm going to go on, but again, I said, yes, ma'am. Still moving. There's a lot of things going on. What? Okay. So, Jason, what are the first 3 things you would think of in that scenario? So it gives us a chance to talk here at the end. I just want to take a few minutes to talk about the spiritual application, No, it's not going to do it. Spiritual importance of the flood. Oh, you're good. I messed you up by clicking out of it. Yeah, let's get that one. I think there really is some good data in here. We probably should watch the video, but I do want to talk the spiritual stuff though. Because what do we always what are the lessons we take from the flood? What are the lessons we think about when it comes to the flood specifically? Don't think about how much faith Noah had to build the ark. Think about the flood itself and what it represented. That's the most timid hand I've ever seen you raise. There you go. Yeah, that's one of the points they make here is this idea that that the flood. Oh, I'm on the wrong side. That the flood was a physical depiction of how God feels about sin. How does God feel about sin? He wants to wipe it out, right? He wants to just get rid of it in 100%. The other thing, and so if I do that, it's this one. And he makes an interesting point here. So there are several of us that really enjoy going to Gatlinburg. I'm looking around the room, seeing a few grins, you know. When we look at these, it's like, this feels like home to me, because when Wendy and I go there, it's like, this is the most relaxing scene I have. But he says when we look at these mountains, we should think about the fact that sin caused them. Because of the sin that was in the world, these mountains came to exist. It's a very interesting concept. Very interesting way to look at it. And so it says, but the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away in a great noise, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up. Therefore, since all these things will be dissolved, what manner of persons ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness? He says, Peter's reminded of his audience of the flood. He's warning them that this judgment, that the flood brought judgment, and that God will bring judgment as well. So that was an interesting thought to me. Any other lessons that people learn from the flood? Yes, sir. Well, and you were only allowed one, so I'm going to take your first one. Because I agree with the second one, but he didn't list it. So that was why I kind of... These feel very negative, right? They feel very pessimistic. He talks about how the flood was a physical... not pessimistic. It's just the don't do side versus the do side. So... the flood was a physical depiction of how God feels about sin, but then he talks about, as you just said, the global flood of Noah is a reminder of the global judgment that looms in the future. That looms in the future, and God demands that we live a holy and godly life. But the flood is also a reminder of God's grace, which, like the beauty that can be seen covering the mountains of the earth, covers our transgressions. So, it's very interesting to look at it from that perspective. I had a professor and when I went to school that talked about how the flood was a way to cleanse the earth. We talk about the power of water and how God uses water. And that's what I look at when I look at these. You know, did anybody talk about the rainbow at all? And the promise and all of that was meant by that at that final day. I guess that wasn't part of the flood. That was after the flood and part of the covenant that was made in the Noah covenant. But can you put my little list up there? One of my favorite, okay, that's my eyes. I thought it was out of focus. Now I can see it better. One of my favorite things to look at is themes throughout the Bible. And when you look at the theme of water throughout the Bible, I think it's valuable. I think it's important to see that God uses, the flood seems so dramatic, but it's not anything out of the ordinary for God. God and Jesus both used water so many times to show his power, to show his authority. And he used water to do so many things like cleansing the earth, protecting his people, delivering them and healing them. It's just so interesting to me. I think at the pool of Siloam, how Jesus is standing there and he says, "Go wash." He could have snapped his fingers and he could have seen, but he said, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam." And that's so powerful to me. He's like, see how much I can do for you through water. And that validates for me the flood that we have to go through when we want to be saved. Yes, Bill? Yeah. Yep. Definitely. Completely agree. Okay. Any other thoughts, questions? Strange ideas? So that was all he had in here. I like I said, I skipped a little bit of the sciencey stuff. If anybody wants a copy, I'm happy to run off a copy. Am I allowed to do that? I'm looking past you, John, at your son. I didn't know what kind of copyright you had on how many copies you could make, but yeah. Okay, yeah. Don't sell it after I make a copy for you, but if you want a copy, you can have it. Huh? Yeah, we're going to watch eBay over the next 17 days. Yeah. And we're up here. Imagine you've never experienced rain, you've never seen the type of flooding that's going on, and then you spend 12 months on this boat, right? Right, exactly. It's all faith, right? I mean, it's all, God said he'd take care of us. We're okay. The lion's not going to eat me. Huh? Faith, yeah. Any other thoughts? Yes, sir. Yeah. Jesus is the ark, you know. I do wonder if they had jiggly legs when they got off the boat, though, and touched their feet on the ground. Did any of Noah's sons kiss the earth and go, "Yes, thank you"? I don't know. I mean, I'm just being a little tongue-in-cheek there, but all right, let's have a prayer. Oh, that's what you were getting ready to tell me. Good. I was reading your mind. Let's have a prayer, and then we'll dismiss back to the group. Heavenly Father, thank you for this night. Thank you for this opportunity that we have to spend together, to study your word, and to think about, Lord, just how awesome you are. We're so grateful for your love, your mercy, and your grace, especially as we witness your power and understand exactly, Lord, how much your mercy should mean to us. Lord, thank you for your saving grace, that you have brought us through the waters as you have and allowed us to experience that salvation, that cleansing as Noah and his family did. Lord, we're grateful for this church family. We're grateful for Jonathan and Jennifer and their efforts on VBS this week. And Lord, we thank you for the food that we have and the food that we're about to gather around. And Lord, I pray that you bless it, that you bless our fellowship. Lord, that we look at each other and remember just how precious each of us is in your sight. Lord, thank you for Jesus. Thank you for blessing us and loving us and for saving us. In Jesus' name, amen.